So I'm Colleen Rathgeb from the Office of Head Start, and I am a little bit of the outlier on this panel because I'm not talking about states. So I think kind of to get at, Catherine's point about kind of trying to align across the multiple quality improvement systems, and what Raina was just talking about is how we can kind of have a common focus. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the national system that Head Start is using around quality improvement with this group, because I think often state folks and research folks kind of don't know what we're doing, and I think it's really helpful for folks across different sectors to understand it. So I think we're running a little bit ahead of time, so I hope I get a few extra moments because I'm trying to squeeze a lot in. So in the last Head Start reauthorization, there was a big change that they made to the Act, and it changed Head Start grants that had typically been, since it was started, indefinite grants. So programs got their Head Start renewal automatically as long as they weren't providing such poor performance that they would kind of refuse to correct problems and we could legally take it away. So it set up a system that there was a lot of continuity and very little change in the systems. And so Congress said that HHS should develop a system to determine how you do this designation renewal, how we determine that someone should be designated as a Head Start program again. And they said that those programs that we're providing, we could determine that they're providing high quality, comprehensive services, we should stay with this automatic renewal. But in cases where we can't make that determination, there should be a competition for those service areas. So just a second on, we went through a long process to develop how we decide, because Congress said, you want to do this, but we don't know to tell you how to decide who's providing the high quality services and should get automatic and who's not and should go to competition. So we had an advisory committee that issued a report in 2009, and then we went through a regulatory process where we put out a notice saying how we were going to do this. 16,000 people commented on that proposal. We spent quite a bit of time reading and dealing with those comments, and then we finally issued a rule that says there's 7 conditions. If you meet one of these conditions, you have competition. So essentially how it works is if you meet one of these 7 conditions, if you don't meet one, you automatically are renewed. If you do meet one, you go into an open competition. In that competition, we issue a funding opportunity announcement for the area where there's competition. There's a full set of evaluation criteria that every applicant is judged on. So we have 7 conditions that we look at. Again, if you meet one of these 7 conditions, you go into competition. The first, and I'm going to talk about 2 of these a little bit more with folks, but I wanted to just give everyone an idea of the 7 conditions. The first is that you've been issued a deficiency, which is something that we, as a Head Start specific term in our Act, that we basically have found that you have a systemic or substantial failure in meeting our program standards. So we go out and look at least every 3 years, but often more frequently, and if you have a deficiency, you go into competition. If you have low class scores, and we're going to talk more about how we're defining low class scores, you go into competition. Failing to establish and utilize school readiness goals to improve children's progress also will cause competition, which we'll talk a little bit about more. And then there's four conditions that are very infrequent in the Head Start community, but so serious that they'll also cause competition. That's if your license is revoked, if we've suspended you from operating, if you've been disqualified or debarred from another federal agency, which is usually evidence of serious financial problems, or if you have this very serious audit problem, which is called a going concern, which is essentially there are so many fiscal problems they're likely to go bankrupt. So I want to talk specifically, because I think it's kind of the most connected to the QRIS systems, about class and how we're using school readiness data. So class, we actually, also in the 2007 Act, we were required, not class per se, but we were required to use a valid, reliable observational instrument that looks at classroom quality and particularly looks at teacher-child interaction. So we're required to use that as monitoring and required to use that in the designation renewal system. So we spent a good deal of time after that passed talking to experts, many folks in the room, and they were here yesterday, to say, what could we use to meet this definition? And across the board, everybody said class is really what you need to use to meet this definition, and we have been using that since that time. The way we started with class, we technically, since 2007, had the requirement that we should have been using it in monitoring. but we very purposefully took a slower approach to introduce it to the community before we got to the accountability phase, which is where we're at now, 5 years later. So we started in 2008 with a professional development effort, training programs, Head Start supervisors across the country in the tools so that they could understand what it would measure, they could get reliable, and they could think about how you could use class or a tool like class in professional development of their teachers. So we've had ongoing professional development since that time, and as folks talked about yesterday, there's a lot of challenges in how to get that right at a scaled up approach, and so we won't pretend that we're getting it perfectly, but we are doing quite a bit of effort to continue to use that as a quality improvement tool as well. In 2009, we began piloting how we would do this as part of our monitoring, so how we would scale up to use it as a monitoring tool. And we actually took 2 years where we did the class as part of our on-site review, gave the programs the data, but there was no accountability attached. So 2012 is the first year, so last school year, that we've actually been conducting the class and that there will be accountability connections. We had put quite a few improvements in place, things that we're very confident in the way that we're collecting it now, particularly that we have a random sample, we feel very confident in our training, our reliability, and the protections we put around that, and also what we've decided around how often the cycles that we use for observation and timing. So because of the Head Start program, we're trying to get a picture of the grantee level scores, not exactly what's going on in one classroom. We do the protocol slightly differently. We see more classrooms for fewer time. But we think that's important, again, because we're trying to get a picture at this grantee level, which can be the same as a child care program. We have some Head Start grantees that, they are the same thing as one program. We have another Head Start grantee that could be an entire school system or the entire city of New York. And so it's a little bit, that's, I think, one of the complications of aligning our systems is it's not always apples to apples of what you'd be thinking about in a QRIS system. So the way we are defining that you have low class scores so that it would require competition is that each year we go out and all of our preschool center-based classrooms will do a class observation. It's about 400 or 500 grantees a year. And so we have an average score at the domain level in emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support for each of those grantees. Any grantee that's in the lowest 10% of all the grantees that we reviewed, if you're in the lowest 10% on any one of those domains, you'll go into competition. With two kind of more complicating caveats, that we also have bare minimums, and these really are bare minimums, that we had wanted to say that if at some point we would see so many Head Start programs below these minimums, more than 10% would go in. And similarly, if over time we see such improvement in Head Start programs that those grantees actually in the lowest 10% are getting a score above a 6 or above on any one of the domains, less than 10% would go into competition. So this is just a snapshot of what we're seeing from this first year of data with the random sample. So we are seeing, I think, as not surprising, much higher scores on our emotional support and classroom organization and lower on instructional support. These are higher than we have seen in Head Start research. So in research and FACES, the scores are higher. This is, again, it's different. We're doing it in a slightly different way with the more classrooms, fewer cycles. We also are in there when programs know that we're monitoring them, and programs have been told and have known that they would be held accountable for these. So it's not all apples to apples what we're looking at, but this is what we're seeing, obviously, the most gross for instructional support. And one thing we'll talk about is the challenge, the very kind of compressed distributions. So the other one I want to quickly talk about, and then just jump into some implications, is the way we're using child outcomes assessment in the system. So there was a lot, when we had the advisory committee, there was robust discussion about whether or not we should actually be using child assessment data. And where they came to was we really should focus on how programs are using child assessment data. And so that's kind of where we've landed in our condition. And so we state how agencies have to establish their own program goals for the improvement of children's school readiness on certain domains, aligned with states. We have some particular requirements there with early learning guidelines. And that they have to use them for two purposes. They have to show that they're using those that they're actually analyzing individual ongoing child level data to individualize for kids. So they know where children are and teachers are individualizing, and that they are regularly aggregating and analyzing that data to make program improvements. So we really want them to be thinking about how are they using that data, how can they show us they're using that data to make curriculum, professional development, and those types of decisions. So a couple just quickly on the lessons or challenges that we've seen. One is really figuring out how to engage the community, both in the decision making and the ratings, but also when you get into the idea of competition. So I think at the theoretical level, most programs think I want the best Head Start program in my community that there can be, but programs are also, and communities are very attached to the providers that have been there for many, many years. We like, one of the things we really like, I think, about the way this turned out is that we are really focusing on what we want programs to do. That we really, one of the things I think has been very positive about class is it's really changed the discussion about what do we want teachers to be doing in classrooms and putting a big focus there. Similarly, with the way you're using data, I think it's really pushed the conversation of, so programs collect a ton of data, what should they be doing with it? We think one thing's been a challenge is how do we ensure that we do align the TA to support the improvement, at the same time, keeping it separate from the accountability. And so that's definitely a challenge. We also think, and I think this gets to something I think Catherine was talking about before, how simple is the system? We, with the advisory committee, had lots of, you could design different points by all sorts of different metrics and add up the points and different cuts. And finally, I think where we landed is it was too hard for people to be able to understand. And so while we're also criticized in the kind of one strike and you're out approach of the 7 conditions, it is understandable. Not out. You're into competition, I should say, right? I think the other, we obviously have to put a lot of focus on, the validity and the reliability and the sensitivity of the measures. This year is the first year that class is being used for actually decision-making purposes. That low is 10%, and obviously when there's the distributions that you saw, there are programs that are very similar scores, that one is going into competition and one is not. And I think one of the other big struggles we've had is how do you encourage innovation when folks really are worried about consequences? And I think when I heard John talking yesterday about being in the foxhole and worrying about Head Start monitoring, that's obviously not where we want teachers to be. So obviously getting the balance right between innovation, but holding folks accountable on things that we think are important and matter is always a struggle. So thank you.